July 23, 1944, 05:47 hours. The Normandy countryside lay wrapped in a thick morning mist that clung to the hedgerows like a burial shroud. In the pre-dawn darkness, 500 German tankers of the 2nd Panzer Division sat inside their Tigers and Panthers, engines idling, exhaust vapor mixing with the fog. They had been waiting for 3 hours in a defensive formation along the Bocage, the ancient hedgerow country that turned every field into a natural fortress. The air smelled of diesel fuel, wet earth, and the metallic tang of gun oil. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, commander of the 3rd Company, 2nd Panzer Regiment, sat in the turret of his Tiger the Marne, watching the eastern horizon through his periscope. His fingers drummed against the cold steel interior. They were confident, they were experienced. They had crushed Soviet armor at Kursk, driven British tanks into the sea at Dunkirk, and reduced French columns to burning scrap metal in 1940. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The Panther's sloped armor could deflect all but the luckiest shots. These were not the frightened conscripts of 1918. These were veteran panzer crews who had survived 3 years of mechanized warfare on 2 continents. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that 60 American Sherman tanks of the 3rd Armored Division were already in position, less than 400 meters away, hidden in the dense bocage, their engines silent, their crews motionless. The Americans had moved during the night without headlights, guided by French resistance scouts who knew every farm path and drainage ditch in the region. They had positioned themselves not for a frontal assault, which would have been suicide against Tigers and Panthers, but for something the Germans had never encountered from American forces: a coordinated ambush using terrain, deception, and a tactical doctrine that prioritized speed and overwhelming firepower over individual tank superiority. The Germans were waiting for a predictable attack from the east, along the main road where their long-range guns would dominate. The Americans were preparing to attack from 3 directions simultaneously. From the Bocage hedgerows the Germans thought were impassable to armor. To understand why 500 German tankers would panic that morning, why experienced veterans would abandon their tanks and flee on foot through fields still wet with dew, why radio operators would transmit frantic messages describing an impossible American assault. One must first understand what German armor doctrine had become by the summer of 1944. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions had been built on a philosophy of qualitative superiority. Fewer tanks, but each one a technological masterpiece capable of destroying multiple enemy vehicles. The Tiger I weighed 54 tons and could engage targets at distances where enemy guns were useless. The Panther, rushed into production after the shock of encountering Soviet T-34s, combined thick sloped armor with a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate any Allied tank in existence. German crews were trained for long-range duels, firing from concealed positions, using their superior optics and gun performance to destroy approaching enemies before they could return effective fire. This doctrine had worked brilliantly against Soviet mass assaults and British armored attacks. It had created a psychological advantage as powerful as the technical one. German tankers believed they were invincible. The American approach to armored warfare was completely different, and in July 1944, the Germans fundamentally misunderstood it. The M4 Sherman medium tank was inferior to German heavy armor in almost every measurable category. Its 75mm gun struggled to penetrate Tiger and Panther frontal armor except at point-blank range. Its armor could be pierced by German guns at distances where American crews couldn't even see their targets. German intelligence officers mockingly called them Tommy Cookers and Ronsons, cigarette lighters that ignited on the first strike. German panzer crews had studied captured Shermans and concluded that American industrial production was simply throwing quantity at the problem, flooding the battlefield with mediocre machines crewed by inexperienced soldiers who would be slaughtered the moment they faced veteran German armor. This assessment was not entirely wrong, but it missed the fundamental point. The Americans were not trying to build better individual tanks. They were building a better system. The 60 Shermans hidden in the Normandy bocage that morning represented something the Germans had not encountered before: a combined arms coordination that integrated armor, infantry, artillery, and air support into a single overwhelming assault mechanism. Each Sherman carried a radio that could communicate not just with other tanks, but with infantry companies, artillery batteries, and forward air controllers. Each crew had been trained not to win individual duels, but to operate as part of a larger tactical formation that would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond. The American doctrine accepted that individual Shermans would be destroyed. The casualty rates were built into the planning, but calculated that speed, numbers, and coordination would break German defensive positions before the superior German guns could systematically eliminate the American force. It was a brutal mathematics, one that traded American lives and machines for tactical success. But it was a calculation the United States could afford to make, and Germany could not. At Oro 6:12 hours, the first Sherman fired. The sound was different from what the German crews expected. Not the deep, authoritative boom of a Tiger's 88mm gun, but a sharper, more rapid crack. Then another, then a dozen more, all within seconds. The Germans had been trained to identify threats by sound, and the rapid succession of American guns told them something impossible was happening. They were being fired upon from the bocage itself. From terrain, their intelligence officers had declared impassable to armor. Miller's Tiger lurched as a 75mm shell struck the rear deck, not penetrating the thick armor, but sending a shower of sparks across the engine compartment. His driver screamed into the intercom. The Tiger was designed for frontal engagement, not for threats from multiple directions. Before Miller could issue orders, 3 more impacts hammered the Tiger's sides and rear. Still no penetration, but the psychological effect was devastating. They were surrounded. The American assault was not elegant. It was not a demonstration of superior technology. It was a coordinated eruption of overwhelming force from positions the Germans had thought secure. Shermans burst through hedgerows that German engineers had calculated were too thick for armored passage. Their crews, having spent the previous week modifying their tanks with makeshift steel tusks welded to the front hulls. Rhino tanks that could tear through the ancient Norman hedges. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, German crews were reporting American armor attacking from the north, west, and south simultaneously. The careful German defensive formation, designed to create overlapping fields of fire against a predictable eastern approach, became a trap. Tigers and Panthers had to rotate their turrets 180 degrees to engage threats from behind, exposing their vulnerable sides and rear armor to other American tanks. The German advantage in long-range gunnery became meaningless at 400 meters in dense terrain, where visibility was measured in tens of meters, not kilometers. The panic that swept through the German formation was not cowardice. These were veteran crews who had survived Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. where thousands of armored vehicles had clashed across open steppe. They had held their positions under Soviet artillery barrages that lasted for hours. They had faced T-34s attacking in waves of 50 and 100 vehicles. But this was different. The Soviets attacked in predictable masses that German gunnery could systematically reduce. The British attacked with careful preparation, but telegraphed their intentions with artillery bombardments. The Americans attacked with a speed and chaos that made coordinated defense impossible. German radio discipline collapsed within minutes. Tank commanders shouted contradictory information. Panthers destroyed on the left flank. Americans emerging from the southern hedgerows. Request permission to withdraw. We are surrounded. Müller, attempting to coordinate his company's response, realized with cold horror that he had no idea how many American tanks were actually attacking. The reports suggested hundreds. Intelligence had promised there were no significant American armored forces within 20 kilometers. The truth was precisely 60 Shermans. But the Americans had learned to create the impression of overwhelming numbers through rapid movement and coordinated fire. Each Sherman, after firing several rounds, would displace to a new position, creating the impression of a constantly expanding American force. Infantry teams equipped with bazookas moved through the hedgerows, engaging German tanks from positions where the armored vehicles couldn't bring their guns to bear. American artillery, pre-registered on German positions by forward observers hidden in the bocage since the previous night, began dropping high-explosive shells that didn't destroy tanks, but killed exposed crewmen and severed radio antennas. The Germans found themselves fighting not a tank battle, but a combined arms ambush where their technological superiority in armored combat became irrelevant. A Tiger I could defeat 10 Shermans in open terrain at long range. But at close range, surrounded by infantry, under artillery fire, unable to communicate or coordinate, separated from supporting units, even a Tiger became a steel coffin. 17 minutes into the engagement, the first German crew abandoned their Panther. The tank was not destroyed. It had taken multiple hits that damaged its tracks and transmission, but hadn't penetrated the armor. But the crew, hearing American infantry approaching with satchel charges and unable to rotate the turret fast enough to engage Shermans appearing from multiple directions, made the calculation that the tank had become a death trap. They climbed out and ran into the hedgerows. Within minutes, other crews followed. Müller watched through his periscope as a Tiger 200 meters away simply stopped fighting, its crew scrambling out of the hatches and disappearing into the morning fog. His gunner had destroyed 2 Shermans, clean kills that would have earned commendations any other day. But 4 more American tanks had taken their places, firing from positions where his Tiger's gun couldn't depress low enough to return fire effectively. His radio operator was screaming that headquarters wasn't responding. His driver reported that the engine was overheating. The Tiger, I was a mechanical monster that required constant maintenance, and they had been idling for 3 hours before the attack. The symbolic object that would haunt German tankers who survived that morning was not a weapon, but a sound. Not the crack of American guns or the scream of artillery, but the sound of American radios. In the chaos of the engagement, German crews could hear American radio transmissions bleeding through on adjacent frequencies. Calm voices speaking English, coordinating movements, calling in artillery strikes, directing infantry teams, communicating with aircraft that German spotters reported were circling above the cloud cover. The Germans had radios, but their communication doctrine was hierarchical and formal. Tank commanders reported to company commanders, who reported to battalion commanders, who requested permission from regimental headquarters to adjust tactics. The Americans seemed to communicate laterally, directly, constantly. A Sherman commander could call artillery fire directly. An infantry lieutenant could coordinate with tank platoons without routing requests through multiple command levels. The speed of American decision-making, enabled by radio communication that treated junior officers as autonomous decision-makers, created a tempo of operations the German command structure couldn't match. By 0645 hours, 33 minutes after the first shot, the German defensive position had disintegrated. Approximately 200 German tankers had abandoned their vehicles and were retreating on foot through the bocage. Another 150 were dead or wounded, killed not primarily by American tank fire, but by artillery and infantry that had systematically isolated and destroyed immobilized German vehicles. The remaining German crews attempted to form a new defensive line 1,500 meters to the east. But American forward observers had already called in artillery fire on likely withdrawal routes. The Panthers and Tigers that had survived the initial ambush found themselves under accurate artillery fire the moment they attempted to move. The American combined arms system, which the Germans had dismissed as inefficient and over-reliant on supporting elements, had turned the bocage into a killing ground where German armor superiority was neutralized by terrain, coordination, and an operational tempo that made prolonged defense impossible. The American losses were significant by any measure except the one that mattered. 14 Shermans had been destroyed, with another 11 damaged but recoverable. 63 American tankers were dead, with 92 wounded. In a traditional armored engagement, these would be catastrophic losses, a casualty rate of nearly 40%. But the Americans had destroyed or captured 37 German tanks, including 12 Tigers and 17 Panthers, and scattered a German panzer battalion that would take weeks to reconstitute. The mathematics was brutal but clear. America could replace 14 Shermans in 2 weeks. Germany could not replace 12 Tigers in 6 months. America could train replacement crews at bases in Texas and Louisiana and ship them to France. Germany was drafting teenagers and old men. The Americans had not won because their tanks were better. They had won because their system was more sustainable, more adaptable, and more aligned with the industrial and demographic reality of 1944. What the 500 German tankers experienced that morning was not primarily a military defeat. It was an ideological shock. The German panzer forces had been built on a philosophy that emphasized individual excellence, technological superiority, and the warrior cult that had dominated Prussian military thinking for a century. A Tiger crew was trained to think of themselves as elite warriors, piloting a weapon that represented the pinnacle of military engineering. The tank was more than a machine. It was a symbol of German technical mastery and martial tradition. The Americans challenged this entire worldview not with better individual tanks, but with a system that treated tanks as replaceable tools in a larger industrial process. To German eyes, this seemed almost barbaric, a violation of the warrior ethos that elevated courage and skill above mere production capacity. But that American approach reflected a different ideology entirely. The democratic industrial state where individual lives had value because they were replaceable, where technology was a means rather than an end, where victory came not from cultivating warrior elites, but from organizing mass production and coordinating complex systems. In the hours after the battle, as American recovery teams began salvaging damaged Shermans and French civilians emerged from cellars where they had hidden during the fighting, German prisoners were marched past the burning wrecks of their Tigers and Panthers. An American lieutenant, conducting preliminary interrogations, noted in his report that the German tankers seemed not frightened but bewildered. They asked questions that suggested they fundamentally didn't understand what had happened. How had the Americans moved through the bocage at night without lights? How had artillery arrived so quickly? How had infantry and armor coordinated without extensive planning and orders from higher command? One German tank commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front with 2 years of combat experience, stated that the attack had seemed chaotic and disorganized, but somehow effective. He could not reconcile the apparent confusion of American operations with the devastating tactical result. The American tactical flexibility, which allowed junior officers to make immediate decisions and coordinate directly with supporting units, seemed to German military culture like a breakdown of discipline rather than a different approach to command. The survivors of the 2nd Panzer Division would carry the memory of that morning through the remainder of the war. In after-action reports and interrogations, a consistent theme emerged: the psychological impact of facing an enemy that didn't fight according to European military traditions. The Americans didn't respect the carefully maintained separation between elite and regular forces. They didn't fight duels or seek glory. They attacked with whatever worked. Tanks, artillery, infantry, air support, all thrown into the battle simultaneously without regard for traditional unit boundaries or tactical elegance. To soldiers trained in a military culture that prized precision, hierarchy, and individual excellence, the American approach seemed almost mindless. But it was precisely that appearance that made it effective. The Americans were not mindless. They were operating according to a different logic, one shaped by industrial mass production, pragmatic problem-solving, and a democratic military culture that valued results over form. The recurring symbol that emerged from German accounts of fighting American armor was abundance. Not skill or courage or technological superiority, but simply abundance. Prisoners reported being stunned by the quantity of American equipment that appeared after the battle. Recovery vehicles that towed away damaged Shermans for repair, supply trucks that delivered ammunition and fuel, medical units that treated wounded tankers with supplies that German medics had not seen in months. One German lieutenant, captured while attempting to organize a defense with the remnants of his company, stated in interrogation that the Americans fought like they had infinite tanks. This was not technically true. The 60 Shermans that attacked that morning represented a significant portion of the 3rd Armored Division's available medium tanks, but the American logistical system could replace losses and return damaged vehicles to service at a rate that seemed impossible to German soldiers who had learned to hoard ammunition and fuel because resupply was uncertain. The abundance was real, but it was not natural. It was the result of an industrial and logistical system that could produce tanks in Detroit, ship them across an ocean, and maintain them in combat at the end of a supply line that stretched 6,000 kilometers. The battle near the Normandy Bocage on July 23, 1944, was not historically decisive in the way Kursk or El Alamein were decisive. It would not appear in most histories of the Normandy campaign as a major engagement. The official records listed it as a successful armored action that disrupted German defensive preparations and captured or destroyed valuable heavy armor. But for the soldiers who fought there, German and American both, it represented something more significant than tactical victory or defeat. It was a clash between two completely different philosophies of warfare, two different ideologies about what military power meant and how industrial societies should organize violence. The Germans brought technological mastery and martial tradition. The Americans brought industrial abundance and systematic coordination. The Germans lost not because they were cowards or incompetent. The veterans of the 2nd Panzer Division had proven their courage and skill on 2 continents. They lost because they were fighting according to rules that no longer applied, using a tactical doctrine designed for a different kind of war. In the weeks following the battle, German military intelligence attempted to analyze what had happened. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht command structures describing American tactical innovations. The hedge-cutting tanks, the forward air controllers, the radio-coordinated combined arms attacks. German officers studied these reports and attempted to develop countermeasures. But the deeper problem was not technical or tactical. It was systemic. The Americans could lose tanks at rates that would cripple German formations and continue attacking. They could grant tactical decision-making authority to junior officers without fearing loss of central control. They could integrate new equipment and tactics rapidly because their military culture emphasized practical results over doctrinal purity. These were not problems that could be solved with better training or improved technology. They were the product of fundamentally different approaches to organizing military power. Approaches shaped by different political systems, different industrial capacities, and different cultural values. The panzer crew that abandoned their vehicles that morning were not fleeing from death. Soldiers in all armies learned to master that fear. They were fleeing from irrelevance. The careful skills they had developed, the tactical doctrines they had mastered, the technological advantages they had relied upon, all of it had been rendered meaningless by an enemy that simply refused to fight the kind of battle German doctrine prepared for. It was a deeply disorienting experience, one that would shape German accounts of fighting the Western Allies for the remainder of the war. American forces were described as wasteful, reckless, ungracious in victory. These characterizations were not entirely inaccurate, but they revealed as much about German military culture as they did about American tactics. The Americans were wasteful by the standards of an army that had learned to husband scarce resources. They were reckless by the standards of military traditions that prized careful planning over rapid adaptation. They were ungracious because they did not treat war as an arena for demonstrating martial virtue, but as a problem to be solved through industrial and organizational superiority. VT-60 Shermans that attacked that morning returned to American lines by midday. Crews were rotated out for rest. Damaged tanks were evacuated to repair depots where they would be cannibalized for parts or rebuilt entirely. Replacement crews were assigned to destroyed vehicles within 48 hours. The system continued functioning with barely a pause. This was perhaps the most significant aspect of the engagement. For the Americans, it was not exceptional. It was not a desperate gamble or a heroic stand. It was standard operations, the kind of combined arms attack that American armored divisions conducted repeatedly throughout the campaign. The tactics employed, night movement, terrain exploitation, combined arms coordination, rapid tempo, were not innovations invented for this specific battle, but standard doctrines taught at training bases in the United States and refined through combat experience in North Africa and Italy. The Americans had built a system that could execute complex operations routinely, that didn't depend on individual brilliance or exceptional courage, but on training, coordination, and material abundance. For historians attempting to understand the German collapse in the West during the summer of 1944, the action near the Normandy bocage offers a microcosm of larger forces. The German army had been built to fight short, decisive campaigns where technological and tactical superiority could achieve quick victories. It was an army designed for the wars of 1870 and 1914. updated with modern equipment, but retaining the fundamental assumption that war was a contest of wills and skills between warrior elites. The American Army was built for sustained industrial warfare, where victory would come from systematic application of superior resources and organizational efficiency. It was an army designed not to win glorious victories, but to grind down enemy forces through relentless pressure and continuous replacement of losses. These two philosophies could not be reconciled. When they collided, the result was German forces that won tactical engagements but lost strategic campaigns, that destroyed more enemy equipment but couldn't replace their own losses, that fought with skill and courage, but found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy that simply had more of everything and a system for using it effectively. The German tankers who survived that morning would spend the remainder of the war, and for many the remainder of their lives, attempting to reconcile what they had experienced with their understanding of military excellence. Some concluded that the Americans had simply been lucky, that the Bocage terrain had neutralized German advantages in a way that wouldn't be repeated in open country. Others blamed German leadership, arguing that better tactics or earlier reinforcement would have changed the outcome. But the most perceptive understood that they had encountered something new, an enemy that had industrialized warfare itself, that treated military operations as a technical problem to be solved through engineering and organization rather than a test of courage and will. This was profoundly disturbing to soldiers who had been raised in a culture that celebrated the warrior as society's pinnacle, that saw military service as the highest form of duty, that believed excellence in combat reflected natural aristocracy. The Americans suggested that war could be won not by the best soldiers, but by the best system, not through individual brilliance, but through collective competence. The symbolic object that emerged from American accounts of the battle was different from the German focus on radios and coordination. For American tankers, the symbol was the Tiger itself, the massive German heavy tank that had dominated their nightmares since North Africa. American crews had been trained to fear Tigers, to understand that their Shermans were outmatched and that survival depended on teamwork and tactics rather than individual combat prowess. But after the Bocage engagement, something shifted. The captured Tigers, towed away for technical evaluation, no longer seemed quite so invincible. They were impressive machines, certainly, but they were also temperamental, fuel-hungry, difficult to maintain, and vulnerable when isolated and overwhelmed. The mystique began to crack. American crews began to understand that the Tiger's reputation was as much a weapon as its 88mm gun, and that reputation could be challenged by tactics that didn't accept the Germans' preferred terms of engagement. This psychological shift, multiplied across hundreds of similar engagements throughout the summer of 1944, would transform American armored forces from a cautious, defensive-minded organization into an increasingly aggressive attack force that understood its true advantage lay not in better tanks, but in better coordination and material abundance. The broader narrative of the Second World War, the panic of 500 German tankers on a foggy morning in Normandy, represents a moment of transition. The German army had entered the war as perhaps the most tactically proficient military force in the world, with doctrines and equipment that had swept aside Polish, French, and early Soviet resistance with stunning speed. But by the summer of 1944, the tactical proficiency was being systematically negated by Allied forces that had learned to organize industrial power more effectively than Germany could organize martial excellence. The Americans, in particular, represented a new kind of military force, one that fully embraced mass production, standardization, and systematic organization not as regrettable necessities, but as core strengths. The American military was not trying to create warrior elites. It was trying to create a machine that could take ordinary citizens, give them standardized training and equipment, and organize them into formations that could defeat enemy forces through superior coordination and material support rather than individual superiority. The battle lasted 33 minutes of actual fighting, followed by 3 hours of mopping up scattered German positions and processing prisoners. American casualties were evacuated to field hospitals where they received treatment that seemed miraculous to captured German wounded. Blood plasma, antibiotics, surgical care provided with supplies that German military medicine had run short of months earlier. The American wounded had a survival rate dramatically higher than German casualties with comparable injuries, not because American doctors were more skilled, but because the logistical system could deliver medical supplies to forward positions in quantities that made aggressive treatment possible. Even in medical care, the pattern repeated. American success came not from superior individual excellence, but from superior systems. A German military surgeon might be more experienced and skilled than his American counterpart, but the American had penicillin, plasma, and morphine in abundance, while the German made do with limited supplies and improvised substitutes. The psychological impact of that morning rippled through German defensive lines far beyond the soldiers who directly experienced the engagement. Stories spread through Wehrmacht units about the American attack, exaggerated with each retelling, transformed into cautionary tales about American numbers and ruthlessness. The truth was dramatic enough without embellishment, but soldiers facing a superior enemy need explanations that preserve their self-respect and unit cohesion. It was easier to believe the Americans had attacked with overwhelming numbers than to admit that comparable forces had achieved victory through better tactics and coordination. It was easier to blame terrain and surprise than to acknowledge that the American combined arms system represented a fundamental challenge to German military doctrine. These psychological defenses were necessary for continued resistance, but they prevented the German army from adapting effectively to the reality they faced. Units continued fighting according to doctrines that no longer worked, continued waiting for technological solutions that Germany could no longer produce in meaningful numbers, continued believing that martial excellence could compensate for industrial inferiority. By early August, the 2nd Panzer Division had been reconstituted with replacement tanks and crews, though it would never return to full strength. The veterans of the Bocage engagement were mixed with fresh crews who had not experienced that morning's shock. In training, the new crews were taught the same doctrines of long-range gunnery and tactical superiority that had failed their predecessors. There was no fundamental rethinking of German armored tactics because the Wehrmacht's institutional culture could not acknowledge that the problem was not execution but doctrine itself. German military leadership continued to believe that technological innovation, the King Tiger, the Panther II, jet aircraft, new anti-tank weapons, would restore tactical superiority. They did not understand, or could not accept, that the Americans had moved beyond competing for tactical superiority to building a system that made tactical superiority strategically irrelevant. Even if every German tank was superior to every American tank, the Americans would still win because they could lose 3 tanks for every 1 German loss and still come out ahead in a strategic sense. The epilogue of the Bocage engagement was written not in military histories but in the memoirs and letters of soldiers who fought there. German accounts consistently emphasized The shock and disorientation of facing an enemy that didn't fight properly, that didn't respect the conventions and tactical logic that European armies had developed over centuries. American accounts emphasized the relief of discovering that German armor could be defeated, that the fearsome Tiger and Panther were vulnerable to tactics and coordination even if they were superior in individual combat. Neither side fully understood what they had experienced. A clash not just between armies, but between different visions of what military power meant in an industrial age. The Germans represented the old model, where warfare was a contest of skills and courage between professional armies, where technological excellence and tactical brilliance could compensate for numerical inferiority. The Americans represented a new model, where warfare was an industrial process that consumed resources and produced strategic outcomes through systematic organization and material abundance. In the decades after the war, military historians would debate the lessons of armored combat in Northwest Europe. Some focused on tactical innovations, the hedge-cutting tanks, the improved coordination between armor and infantry, the development of specialized anti-tank tactics. Others emphasized the material balance, the simple fact that Allied industrial production overwhelmed German capacity to replace losses. But perhaps the deeper lesson was about organizational philosophy. The Americans had built a military system that assumed individual soldiers and machines were replaceable, that victory came from effective organization rather than exceptional individuals, that military power was fundamentally about coordinating complex systems rather than demonstrating individual prowess. This approach violated traditional military culture in fundamental ways. It seemed to devalue courage, skill, and individual sacrifice. But it worked. It worked because modern industrial warfare was not primarily about individual combat, but about organizing and sustaining large-scale violence over extended periods. The side that could maintain higher operational tempo, replace losses more quickly, adapt tactics more rapidly, and coordinate supporting elements more effectively, would win regardless of individual tactical outcomes. The 500 German tankers who panicked that morning were not cowards. They were soldiers who discovered that the rules they had learned, the skills they had mastered, the traditions they embodied, all of it had been rendered obsolete by an enemy that fought according to different principles. It was a deeply existential experience, one that called into question not just their tactical effectiveness, but their understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. In a very real sense, they were experiencing the death of an old model of warfare and the birth of a new one. The Americans were not better warriors. They were representatives of a different kind of military power, one that fully embraced industrial modernity and democratic organization. Where German military culture emphasized hierarchy, expertise, and the cultivation of elite forces, American military culture emphasized flexibility, pragmatism, and the effective organization of mass forces. Where Germans saw tanks as weapons to be mastered by skilled crews, Americans saw them as tools to be deployed by a system. Where Germans organized around the assumption that superior skill and technology would prevail, Americans organized around the assumption that superior systems and resources would prevail. On that foggy morning in July, when 60 American Shermans emerged from hedgerows the Germans had thought impassable, when radios crackled with coordinated commands in English, when artillery fire arrived within minutes of being called, when infantry and armor attacked together in ways that German doctrine said required extensive planning and coordination. In that moment, 500 experienced German tankers encountered the future of warfare and found themselves unprepared. They panicked not because they lacked courage, but because they suddenly understood that their courage was insufficient, that their skills were irrelevant, that the magnificent machines they crewed were being defeated not by better machines, but by a better system. It was the panic of obsolescence, the terror of discovering that everything they had trained for and believed in had become insufficient. They were the cavalry facing machine guns, the craftsmen facing assembly lines, the elite facing mass production. They were warriors in an age that was moving beyond the warrior ideal to something more impersonal, more systematic, more aligned with industrial rather than martial values. The battle ended in American victory, but both sides lost something that morning. The Germans lost men, machines, and morale, but the Americans, in their systematic victory, demonstrated a vision of warfare that was profoundly dehumanizing even as it was effective. The reduction of soldiers to replaceable parts in a larger system, the acceptance of high casualties as acceptable if the mathematical calculation favored overall success, the transformation of war from a contest of courage to an industrial process, these were victories that came at a moral cost that would only become fully apparent in later conflicts. But in July 1944, those philosophical questions were irrelevant. The Americans had developed a way to win, a system that could defeat German tactical excellence through superior organization and resources. The 500 German tankers who abandoned their Tigers and Panthers that morning were fleeing not from death, but from irrelevance, from the terrible discovery that excellence was no longer enough, that the future belonged not to the best soldiers, but to the best organized forces. The morning mist burned off by 0800 hours, revealing the full scope of the battlefield. Burning tank hulls dotted the hedgerows. American infantry teams moved methodically through the bocage, clearing remaining German positions. Recovery vehicles were already towing damaged Shermans toward rear areas for repair. The system had functioned as designed. Losses had been significant, but acceptable. The mission was accomplished, and 60 American Shermans, having crushed 500 German tankers in 33 minutes of chaos, moved forward to the next objective, already forgotten by a war machine that measured success not in individual battles, but in sustained operational tempo. The Germans would remember that morning with horror and confusion. The Americans would record it as another successful action in a campaign that stretched across continents. Both reactions revealed a truth about the war they were fighting. It had become too large, too industrial, too systematic for individual courage or skill to change its fundamental trajectory. What mattered now was organization, production, and the willingness to accept the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare. The age of the warrior had ended, the age of the system had begun, and on a foggy morning in Normandy, 500 German tankers had learned that lesson in the most terrible way possible.